Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to a completely broken furnace with a foot of heavy snow piled high outside, your window realizing there is no space heater to turn on, no wool blanket arriving from an online store, and no delivery app capable of bringing a hot meal to your doorstep, leaving nothing but you, the brutal cold, and a very genuine chance that you will not survive until the spring. And then imagine that this is not just a single bad week, but rather the exact way every single winter plays out for 10,000 years straight, because that was the ordinary reality for our ancient ancestors, who somehow found a way to make it through. We are looking back at a massive stretch of roughly 300,000 years, an epoch that covers not only the rise of fully modern Homo sapiens, but also our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, who had already been mastering the art of Ice Age survival long before our own species ever arrived on the scene. If you think a modern winter in the northern plains sounds rough, you are simply not prepared for the reality of the ancient world, because at the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, average global temperatures ran somewhere around 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than they are today. Now, 11 degrees might sound small when written on paper, but that tiny gap represents the catastrophic difference between a modern metropolis standing where it does today and that exact same ground being buried underneath more than half a mile of solid, crushing ice. Enormous stretches of North America, Europe, and Asia sat permanently locked beneath ice sheets thousands of miles across, and even in the milder regions where humans actually managed to live, the winter cold routinely dropped so low that a modern human, equipped with every piece of high-tech gear available today, would struggle to survive for more than a handful of days if exposed to the elements. Yet, despite this hostility, the frozen landscape was absolutely teeming with life. Home to woolly mammoths, massive cave bears, giant short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, and Irish elk carrying antlers that stretched wider than a modern car is long. These colossal animals represented the single greatest danger these ancient people faced, while simultaneously serving as the exact resource that kept entire communities alive. Because the world's water was locked up in these massive glaciers, global sea levels sat roughly 400 feet lower than they do in our modern era, physically connecting land masses that are separated by deep open ocean today. Britain was not an island, but was physically attached to mainland Europe, while a massive, now submerged land bridge joined Siberia and Alaska into a single continuous continent, meaning the entire map of the planet looked fundamentally different, and ancient people routinely walked across ground that now sits silently at the bottom of the sea. This was a freezing, hostile world, almost completely unrecognizable compared to anything we know today, yet it was entirely full of human beings working out the complex mechanics of how not to die in it. To understand how they pulled this off, we have to start with the obvious answer, a tool that deserves considerably more credit than it usually receives: fire. Humans had been controlling flame for somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years. By the time these serious Ice Age winters became a defining challenge for survival, with archaeological sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa showing clear evidence of controlled fire use stretching back 1 million years into the past. Fire was not some recent, unstable breakthrough when the deep cold hit. It was old, thoroughly understood, and it was doing considerably more complex work for the human species than simple warmth. Cooking with fire made calories dramatically more accessible to our bodies, since cooked food delivers far more usable energy than raw food for the exact same amount of metabolic effort spent digesting it. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued persuasively that this exact shift is what allowed the human brain to expand so dramatically, because our digestive tracts could physically shrink once fire took over a massive part of that metabolic burden, freeing up vast reserves of energy that the brain could use to grow instead. Fire also kept terrifying predators at bay through the long, dangerous nights, since large Ice Age carnivores generally avoid open flame instinctively, giving a sleeping group a genuine chance at seeing the morning light. Beyond that, fire was used to harden wooden spear points into far more effective weapons, It provided essential light through winter darkness that could last for 16 hours a day. It dried out soaked clothing before it could cause fatal hypothermia, and it warmed enclosed shelters to perfectly survivable temperatures. Maintaining that communal flame was itself a highly specialized, critical skill because losing a fire during a howling blizzard with no way to restart it was an immediate death sentence for the entire group, which suggests the person responsible for keeping the fire alive may have ranked among the most valuable members of the community, arguably standing above even the most skilled hunter. Attempting to start a fire from absolute nothingness using hand drills or a bow drill and natural tinder is genuinely difficult, even for a practiced modern bushcraft instructor working in mild, dry weather but attempting it in howling wind with soaked materials during an actual Ice Age blizzard bordered on the impossible. That single fact completely reframes their entire winter strategy. The primary goal was never really about starting a fire. It was about never letting the existing fire die in the first place, leading to a culture of carrying live embers carefully between camps, coals deeply under ash overnight, and treating an active flame as a resource nearly as precious as food itself. Shelter mattered just as much as fire, and ancient humans were considerably more deliberate and engineered about it than popular imagination usually allows. Natural caves offered genuinely excellent protection, since a deep cave holds a remarkably stable interior temperature year-round, typically hovering somewhere in the low 50s Fahrenheit regardless of the brutal conditions raging outside, which is certainly not warm, but is entirely survivable when combined with a small fire and shared body heat. Cave walls also completely blocked the wind, which was vital since wind chill alone can turn an already dangerous cold front into something lethal within a matter of minutes. But caves were not always available where people actually needed to be, especially since resources and game animals moved constantly across the landscape. When no natural cave existed nearby, ancient humans became architects, and excavated shelter sites across Europe and Asia revealed genuinely organized interiors. They featured stone-lined fire pits precisely positioned for maximum heat spread, designated sleeping areas, separate zones for tool-making, and distinct spaces for food preparation, showing planned, deliberate use of space rather than an animal simply taking refuge in a hollow. The most striking example of this Ice Age engineering comes from circular dwellings built almost entirely from massive mammoth bones, discovered at sites including Mezhyrich in present-day Ukraine, and dating back roughly 15,000 years. These structures were assembled from hundreds of individual bones, femurs, shoulder blades, jaws, and vertebrae, all carefully interlocked and stacked into load-bearing walls, then covered with stretched animal hides to create a shelter that kept out the biting wind and largely kept out the winter water. Some of these dwellings required the physical remains of more than 150 separate mammoths, and whether those animals were primarily hunted or carefully scavenged remains a point of debate among historians. But the sheer scale of planning, sourcing, and heavy transport involved is absolutely remarkable. This was true architecture, built from an incredibly unlikely material, constructed by people with nothing but stone tools and an accumulated, collective knowledge of how curved bone braces against itself under a heavy load. This was knowledge that had to be worked out through direct trial, catastrophic failure, and correction, since no earlier generation had left behind a written blueprint for turning the remains of an animal that large into a home capable of standing through a brutal winter. Excavations of these dwellings have turned up hearths positioned exactly at the structure's center, discarded tools, beautifully worked ivory, and food remains scattered precisely where daily life would have left them, providing clear evidence that these were not emergency shelters thrown together in a crisis, but genuine year-round homes that were lived in, maintained, and periodically rebuilt across generations of the same families. Human biology itself carried real adaptations to this kind of intense cold, some of which were behavioral, and others written directly into the human body. Neanderthals who endured genuine glacial conditions for far longer than our own species had, at that point show a distinctly cold-adapted body shape in the fossil record, possessing a broader barrel-like rib cage and proportionally shorter forearms and lower legs compared to modern humans. This specific build reduces the total surface area through which body heat can escape relative to the total volume of the body generating it, operating on essentially the same physical principle that makes a compact round object cool down more slowly than a long, thin one. Modern humans living at high northern latitudes carried their own inherited cold-era adaptation, which was a gradual lightening of skin pigmentation as populations moved into regions with far less annual sunlight. Darker skin blocks more ultraviolet radiation, which is highly protective near the equator, but it becomes a serious liability in a northern region already suffering through months of short, weak winter daylight because it blocks the exact same radiation needed to synthesize vital vitamin D through the skin. Populations that lightened over many generations absorbed just enough additional ultraviolet light to keep producing sufficient vitamin D, even through the darkest, coldest stretches of the year, representing a genetic trade-off shaped directly by the same brutal winters this whole story is about. Neither of these adaptations happened quickly or consciously. Both represent thousands of years of the same brutal arithmetic, where individuals whose bodies happened to retain heat slightly better or synthesize vitamin D slightly more efficiently in low light simply outlasted and out-reproduced those who did not, until an entire population's baseline biology had quietly shifted around the hostile demands of the climate it was living inside. Surviving the winter also depended enormously on other people, and our modern culture's fixation on solitary survival, the image of the lone camper making a fire from 2 sticks for a television audience, has almost nothing to do with how ancient humans actually operated. Core survival groups typically ran somewhere between 20 and 50 people, all deeply connected through wider social networks reaching hundreds or thousands of individuals across a broader territory. And this was not an incidental arrangement. It was deliberately maintained survival infrastructure. Winter demanded highly specialized skills, requiring someone who knew precisely how to butcher a large animal carcass for maximum caloric yield down to the organs and marrow. Someone who knew which frozen roots still held nutrition beneath a foot of heavy snow, and an elder who remembered a similarly brutal winter from decades before and recalled exactly which valleys still held game animals when everywhere else had completely emptied out. Long winter nights when outdoor movement was severely limited by the weather were likely the primary window for passing that massive bank of knowledge along to the young. Stories told beside the crackling fire were not simple entertainment. They were a form of structured education, representing generational survival knowledge compressed into something memorable enough to be retold accurately for decades. An elder who carried detailed knowledge of the surrounding landscape functioned as something close to a living reference library, and losing that person meant losing critical data that could not be easily rebuilt. This is likely precisely why care for older, less physically capable group members shows up so consistently and clearly in the archaeological record, because feeding and protecting someone who could no longer hunt or travel easily was not simple sentiment. It was direct investment in the group's collective memory, the accumulated record of every hard winter that had come before this one, and exactly how the community had made it through. Clothing solved a fundamental problem that no amount of fire or shelter could fully address on its own, since modern humans carry almost no protective body hair and lose heat dangerously fast when exposed to the elements. Researchers have used an unusually clever method to estimate exactly when regular clothing use began by tracking the evolutionary split between head lice and body lice, and since body lice live specifically in the folds of fabric rather than directly on human skin, that genetic divergence is estimated to have occurred roughly 170,000 years ago, marking our earliest solid evidence that humans were consistently covering themselves in garments. By the time the Upper Paleolithic era arrived, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, clothing technology had advanced to a genuinely striking degree. Bone needles recovered from ancient sites across Europe and Siberia are so incredibly fine that modern researchers attempting to replicate them using only period-appropriate tools have found the task exceptionally difficult, with some needle eyes measuring barely a single millimeter across. The burial site of Sunghir in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, preserved 2 children interred, wearing gorgeous garments sewn with thousands of individually carved ivory beads, and the careful reconstruction of that clothing points to a highly advanced, layered system. It featured a close inner layer designed for moisture control, a thick middle insulating layer, and a tough outer layer for wind and water resistance, complete with form-fitting hoods, trousers, and heavy boots. This is essentially the exact same layering principle that modern mountaineering guides still recommend to climbers today, arrived at independently through pure trial, error, and generations of accumulated consequence. Hides were prepared through brain tanning, a labor-intensive chemical process using an animal's own brain tissue, worked deeply into the skin to soften and preserve it, producing a high-grade leather that was durable, reasonably water-resistant, and genuinely warm. Nothing about that process was accidental or occasional. Every large animal killed for food also became the vital raw material for clothing, footwear, bedding, and shelter coverings. Across an entire community, tanning hides and sewing garments likely consumed as many collective hours through the cold months as hunting itself did, operating as a full-scale seasonal industry built entirely around the goal of not freezing to death. Beyond clothing, some communities appear to have addressed the cold directly at the sleeping area itself, using heavy stones heated in the fire and then buried beneath a thin layer of earth or bedding material inside a specialized sleeping pit. This created a slow-release source of radiant warmth that could keep a resting body from losing critical heat overnight, even long after the main fire had burned low. This is a remarkably simple yet brilliant solution, essentially serving as the direct ancestor of the modern heating pad, requiring nothing beyond fire, stone, and the accumulated observation that a rock pulled from the ember stays warm for hours after the flame itself has died down. It is the exact kind of low-tech innovation that leaves almost no dramatic trace in the archaeological record. No elaborate tool, no beautifully carved artifact, just a cluster of fire-cracked stones sitting in an otherwise unremarkable patch of ground. And yet, it likely made the monumental difference between a genuinely restful night and a slow, dangerous slide into hypothermia for people sleeping through the coldest hours before dawn. Staying warm in this environment also demanded an enormous number of daily calories, since a human body actively fighting off intense cold can see its resting metabolic rate climb sharply above normal levels, and any additional physical activity like hunting, hauling heavy firewood, or building shelters push that caloric demand even higher. Falling short of that energetic demand did not produce mild fatigue. It produced hypothermia, slowed thinking, failing physical coordination, and eventual death, often quite quickly. This is exactly why fat, rather than lean protein or carbohydrates, function as the single most valuable nutrient of the entire Ice Age, since fat delivers more than double the calories per gram of either alternative and is precisely what the human body burns to generate internal heat. Large Ice Age megafauna mattered enormously here, because a full-grown woolly mammoth could weigh several tons, a considerable share of that weight consisting of insulating and marbled fat, meaning a single successful kill could plausibly provide hundreds of thousands of calories, enough to sustain dozens of people for weeks at a time. Hunting an animal of that scale, however, was never a simple task, and the archaeological evidence points to highly strategic methods, including driving large animals into muddy, boggy terrain where they became hopelessly trapped, ambushes staged at predictable river crossings, and coordinated group efforts using fire and loud noise to funnel a panicked animal toward a prepared kill site, all requiring real planning, deep discipline, and intense social coordination. Storing that massive caloric windfall required its own brand of human ingenuity, and the permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round, functioned as a natural, highly effective deep freezer. Ancient communities dug storage pits directly into this frozen earth to preserve meat for weeks or months at a time, a deliberate strategy well documented at multiple sites across Siberia and Eastern Europe. Choosing exactly where to dig one of these pits was itself a highly refined skill, since picking the wrong location could cause the pit to flood with meltwater during a brief seasonal thaw, or simply fail to stay cold enough, meaning the people responsible for selecting and maintaining these caches were drawing on detailed, site-specific knowledge of how the ground around them actually behaved across the turning of an entire year. Meat that could not be frozen was instead sliced thin and dried in the biting, cold winter air, extending its usable shelf life considerably, while rendered fat was carefully stored inside containers made from animal bladders or stomach linings. Some evidence even points toward the creation of something close to a prehistoric energy bar, dried pulverized meat mixed thoroughly with rendered fat and occasionally dried wild berries, making it exceptionally calorie-dense and capable of lasting for months without spoiling. Autumn, far from being a season of rest, appears to have been a period of intense, highly coordinated food preparation across the entire community, consisting of hunting, processing, drying, and storing considerably more food than immediate needs required. This served as a deliberate buffer against the worst possible winter, and excavated storage pits at multiple sites contain quantities of preserved food well beyond what a single group could plausibly need for an average season. which researchers interpret as clear evidence of genuine risk planning rather than simple habit, showing communities consciously preparing for the worst winter they could imagine rather than the average one they expected. Not every human group tried to wait out the deep cold in a single, fixed location because reindeer and bison herds moved hundreds of miles between their summer and winter ranges, and the human groups that depended on them moved accordingly rather than staying behind in a landscape that already emptied out of life. Across Ice Age Europe, settlement patterns suggest that many groups spent their summers in higher, open terrain and then moved down into sheltered river valleys for the winter months, since these valleys blocked the worst of the wind, tended to keep at least some water unfrozen, and naturally drew in game animals seeking the exact same lower, sheltered ground. This seasonal movement was clearly planned well in advance rather than improvised on the fly. Since stone tool analysis shows certain unique rock types being carried over distances spanning hundreds of miles, providing undeniable evidence of groups traveling repeatedly along known routes between familiar locations rather than wandering aimlessly across the tundra. A group did not simply wander until it happened upon a valley that looked promising. It moved with complete confidence of people who had made the exact same trip the year before and the year before that, following a detailed mental map refined across multiple lifetimes and passed down with the exact same care as any physical tool. All of this, the management of fire, the engineering of shelter, the tailoring of clothing, the preservation of food, and the strategic seasonal movement, ultimately traces back to a single underlying human capability, which is the ability to imagine a future problem long before it arrives and design a complex solution for it in advance. Something no other animal appears to manage at anything close to the human level. Cave paintings found across famous sites in France and Spain, dating from roughly 40,000 to 17,000 years ago, are usually discussed purely as examples of primitive art or symbolic expression, and they likely were both of those things. But some researchers have proposed they may have also doubled as something closer to a visual knowledge archive. They provided detailed, anatomically accurate depictions of horses, bison, mammoths, and reindeer, tracking seasonal behaviors and physical appearances across generations, on the most durable medium available. To them, solid stone, a related and genuinely unexpected piece of evidence, comes from a site called Dolní Věstonice in the present-day Czech Republic, where archaeologists recovered small, fired clay figurines dating back roughly 26,000 years, providing clear evidence of deliberate kiln firing that may represent the earliest known ceramic technology on the face of the earth. This advanced technology was developed not for practical pottery or everyday cooking vessels, but seemingly for symbolic, artistic, or ritual figures, created by people who were simultaneously managing some of the harshest, most brutal winters our species has ever faced. That single detail completely reframes how we should picture Ice Age life, showing us that this was not a desperate population, with every single spare hour consumed by pure miserable survival, leaving no room for anything else. It was a population organized enough, fed enough, and secure enough in its winter systems that some of its members had the spare time, the raw materials, and the creative motivation to experiment with an entirely new material, discovering that wet clay hardens permanently when exposed to extreme heat, purely for the sake of making something meaningful to them. The psychological side of winter survival mattered just as much as the physical side, since months of confinement, resource scarcity, and constant environmental risk create real conditions for social fracture, and the evidence for shared ritual, music, and ceremony, including beautifully carved bone flutes dating back roughly 40,000 years, suggest these ancient communities understood that deliberately maintained group cohesion was itself a vital survival tool. A group that holds together tightly through the darkest months survives the season, while a group that fractures usually does not. None of that cohesion happened automatically. It required deliberate, repeated investment from everyone involved, through the sharing of meals even when food was scarce, the sharing of song even when morale was low, and the performance of shared rituals marking the eventual return of longer days. These were small, repeated acts that reminded everyone in the group that they were still, despite everything in this together, showing that these were not people passively enduring whatever the harsh season handed them, but human beings actively managing an entire hostile system. They managed the fire that had to be kept alive, the shelter that had to be engineered from whatever materials were available, the bodies of animals and even their own bodies adapting under intense evolutionary pressure, and the massive bank of knowledge that had to be preserved and handed forward with absolutely no writing to store it in. We eventually traded every single piece of that hard-won system for the convenience of central heating, insulated jackets, and the ability to have something hot delivered to our door without ever stepping outside, which is on balance a genuinely excellent trade that no one is complaining about. But it is worth remembering, the next time your furnace clicks on without a second thought, that the entire unbroken chain of human knowledge-making, that comfort possible traces back directly to the people who kept a fragile fire alive through a night colder than almost anything the modern world has ever asked us to face.